Greetings. Today I want to have a conversation with you regarding an important branch of philosophy, moral philosophy that is, known as ethics. Ethics, to me at least, and many philosophers besides, is an activity, not so much this realm of theory that people talk about in wordplay and so on, or a set of codes and rules and regulations put in a book for folks to put on a library shelf. Ethics is about everyday living, everyday decision making, something that we all do on a regular basis. So the very brief and short introduction that I will give to you regarding ethics today is only the beginning, I should hope. And the main overarching perspective in this discussion will be philosophical. To begin with, first and foremost, when one discusses ethics, it is the meta-ethical approach that one takes to looking at ethics, and this is what we're going to be doing today. And what do I mean by meta-ethics? I'm talking about the interpretive stuff. What does it mean? What is the meaning, the latent meaning underneath the descriptions and the theories that are discussed, the various technical differences and overlaps, and the bleeding of one theory into another, the collapsing of one theory into another, and that sort of thing. So in many ways, in academic settings, in conversational settings, when people talk about ethics, they are really practicing meta-ethical techniques, as it were. So I just wanted to set that up and sort of to give us an idea of how to approach, from an academic perspective, how to approach looking at ethics. There are basically two types of ethics in moral philosophy. One is the normative ethic, meaning there should be the various sets of rules and principles that collectively create an amalgam of a system of conduct, of the do's and don'ts, of the universality of things to do, the relativism that might enter the picture, and that sort of thing. So when we talk about those kinds of ethical ideas, we're really talking about the normatives that many societies abide by, and many societies try to change. For example, we could say that we live in a free society such as the United States, which of course we need to put in quotation marks. The notion of freedom should always be debated, but we'll leave that aside for a separate discussion. But let's just assume that we're in a free society. In a free society based on democratic principles, the idea is that the ethical normatives that enter the picture and solidify themselves are subject to change, subject to modification, subject to augmentation, and so on. Another branch of ethics, if we are to look at it in this systematic way, is, and it's an exciting field that many folks, ethicists, philosophers, various technical people in the field of medicine and in the fields of pedagogy and education are practicing, and that is applied ethics. How to get these theories put in place and implement them and influence policy, and that's the business of applied ethics. One caveat here when I'm talking about normative and applied and so on, of course these things are interchangeable in many ways depending on the kind of moral issues that one is looking at. And with applied ethics, we are really entering into the realm of politics. It's extremely political, and in most cases, the applied ethical issues, such as euthanasia, the abortion, the capital punishment, and these sorts of social issues that societies grapple with, are dealt with in the realm of politics. And we see that in every election, for example, whether it's presidential election or even local elections and so on. Politicians use and sometimes abuse these very serious moral issues as a form of applied ethics and take one position juxtaposed against another position and so on, and either use it to their benefit or they use it to change the way in which societies collectively look at these moral issues. So once we have that set up and we can look at ethics from these perspectives, it makes our job a little easier to look at theory as a tool, and each theory will help us unlock certain areas and enter the very complex paradigm of ethics, which is essentially the study of conduct of human beings, the way in which we find morality in our existence. So I'll talk about some of the major theories of ethics first, and then I'd like to also talk to you about existential ethics a little bit. To begin with the normative ethics, I think we need to look at what is known, commonly known as duty ethics, the universal. And one name that comes to mind and has to be considered at all times when one is talking about duty ethics. Of course, we can go back to it's Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher that was influential back in the 18th century. He was influential in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and today. It continues to be influential. And I'll talk about Kant. But before we even look at Kant, we need to go back to the days of Aristotle, the person that gets credited for inventing the system of logic, and that's how we can come up with theories of ethics. We can come up with a collection of ideas put together in a cohesive manner to understand human conduct, to understand the meaning of conscience, the meaning of doing the right thing, the differences between altruism and egoism, and so on. And Aristotle, of course, famously is known for looking at the purpose of life, because he was a teleological philosopher, looking at the purpose of life as being the pursuit of happiness. And the ultimate goal of human beings in the Aristotelian paradigm is to reach the final good, to reach the ultimate happiness, if you like. And of course, there are different versions of this. You look at philosophy of Buddhism, and nirvana perhaps could be interchanged with this notion of happiness and so on. So coming back to Kant, what did Kant have to say about what is known as duty ethics? Well, Immanuel Kant had an upbringing, it was a Christian upbringing. But nonetheless, because of the historical factors, the Enlightenment becoming the prevalent paradigm in much of Europe, and of course, bleeding into other societies, the rest of the world, and so on, Kant believed that the divine command theory, the idea that everything comes from God and shouldn't be questioned, the authoritarian ethics, if you like, is not a reasonable assumption to take, because the whole notion of God is always debatable, it's always problematic, and so on. So we leave the divine command theory aside, because he could easily be refuted, or folks that have the deep belief and have taken that gigantic leap of faith into believing God's commands and so on, will question it at all times. So we leave that aside and look at Kant and how he came up with the so-called a categorical imperative, the principle, the universal principles that he brought forward. is very similar to what we find, say, for example, in Christian philosophy of the Golden Rule, which is what? Which is simply saying, treat other human beings as you would like them to treat you. In other words, treat human beings as ends in themselves and not as means to ends. And this basically philosophically boils down to one element of human beings, and that is dignity. Kant believed, and I tend to agree with this assessment of the human condition, he believed that there's really nothing intrinsic about human beings except for one's dignity. And of course, you look around, you go to any society, whether it's north, south, east, west, which continent, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, America, Europe, anywhere, human dignity is at the center of moral discussions, moral considerations, and acceptance of other human beings. Of course, you look at the history of humanity, whether it's past, present, or perhaps in the future, we'll see that this dignity is attacked, assaulted, and not respected by certain groups, and fought for, and advocated for, and confronted those forces by other groups that want to preserve human dignity. And that is at the backdrop of the notion of categorical imperative, which is about duties of a human being. In Kant's realm of morality, we as human beings have the duty to be our brother's keeper, to borrow a term from a Christian philosophy. In other words, we have the responsibility to be good to others, and we have the responsibility to help others, whether it's our neighbor, whether it's our fellow citizen, or whether it's someone halfway across the world who is suffering, and we can help, we must help. And this type of ethics has nothing to do with desire, has nothing to do whether we like what we're doing or not liking it. It's about duty. It's about having an innate, if you like, responsibility that is built in for us, at least in the Kantian realm. Of course, that becomes problematic, particularly with the sensibilities of human beings in the 21st century, with all the egoism that has pervaded and so on, which I'll get into in a little bit. But let's just look at some of the examples of these principles that Kant is looking at in duty ethics. One of the things about duty ethics is that it's non-consequential. In the philosophical jargon, it's called deontological. It's a deontology of these principles, that meaning that regardless of consequences, you must follow these principles if you are to be a moral person, if you are to be the person that wants to do good, if you are to be the ethically sound kind of human being. You must never lie under any circumstances, regardless of consequences. And you must always treat other human beings as ends, and never think, well, I can use these people because the end result is I can help many others at the expense of using a few people. And that is something that Kant would categorically reject. And today you find folks that actually follow this type of ethical principles and so on. And there's always this debate about the notion of honesty and this whole business of, well, should we lie sometimes? What about this gray area of white lie versus deliberate lie, lying by omission, not saying things that you could be saying, and the end result being that you lied or deceived someone, but for the the purposes of good, and so on. And this is why other theories have come in to challenge duty ethics. And those are known as the consequential theories. The most, shall we say, paramount and the most influential type of consequential theory of ethics is utilitarianism. And we can go to the late 17th, 18th century, start with Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher that came up with the idea of maximizing one's pleasure in life as, sort of his translation of the Aristotelian approach to, pursuing happiness and reaching for the ultimate good. He thought, this is Bentham, he thought that we must take actions towards maximizing pleasure and, i.e. happiness of the majority. Whatever it takes. Sometimes you may have to lie. Sometimes you may have to create policies where certain people will suffer. But if they're in the minority and the majority are gaining pleasure and happiness and additional interest and so on and so forth, that would be okay. And his focus was on pain and pleasure in many ways. And he is the original philosopher, at least, research and books, tell us that started looking at animal rights and saying, well, the question we ought to ask is, the sentient beings, whether it's a human being or it's a cow or a dog or a monkey, do they feel pain? And if they do, then we must not take actions that inflict pain upon them. And so, but nonetheless, ironically, Jeremy Bentham was a meat eater all his life. But this emphasis on pleasure became problematic for folks, and the ones who were utilitarian, believing in the maxim, that is the principle of utilitarianism, that to be utilitarian, you must take actions, you must set up rules that bring the greatest good for the greatest majority. Of course, ultimately, you would like the greatest good for everyone, but you look at the history of humanity, and you see that as an impossibility. But to borrow a phrase from Derrida, it is the possibility of impossibility that the utilitarians are after. After Bentham, John Stuart Mill was the other, English philosopher that thought, well, I think I need to adjust Jeremy Bentham's theory and fix this problem of, pleasure, because it leads to hedonism, and hedonism cannot be good for humanity because it leads to perversion of the seeking pleasure. And the next thing you know, that's all people want to do. And they want to avoid pain. They want to not pay attention to suffering. Therefore, they can make moral mistakes. And of course, we see that happens all the time. Societies collectively make moral mistakes all the time. Where one powerful society with powerful, military and economic might can take advantage of other societies, invade them, kill their citizens, take their land, take their resources, and so on, in the name of protecting their interests, in the name of bringing freedom, democracy, and et cetera, and then calling themselves, well, we're utilitarian. So in order to avoid this sort of approach to utilitarianism, Stuart Mill thought, well, it's not so much the pleasure that we ought to be after, but let's look at what Aristotle taught us and think about the quality of life. Think about happiness. But happiness in what way? It's very difficult to quantify or to measure the amount of happiness that a given society can have. But let's take actions. Let's create rules, if you want to be a rule utilitarian or act utilitarian, which is cases specific, versus, let's apply rules to all cases. let's see if our actions are coming at the expense of other people suffering in bringing about quality of life for a certain group, then we must examine that and re-examine it. And so it was the re-examination process that John Stuart Mill was very much concerned about. Now, utilitarianism, I think, particularly in the applied ethics that I mentioned earlier, it can be helpful in certain areas. For example, one of the most influential philosophers who is a utilitarian today is Peter Singer, who teaches right up here at Princeton. He wrote this book, Animal Rights, and he's been an advocate of animal rights and advocating vegetarianism, and he's a numbers man, bringing facts and figures and saying, well, you look at the facts, we don't really need to eat meat because evolution has brought us to a new place where technology and all kinds of tools given us the ability to feed ourselves with vegetables and get enough nutrients into our system and so on. And we only do it because of taste and pleasure and all of that. And at what cost? At the cost of inflicting pain and suffering on sentient beings, being cows, chickens, pigs, fish, etc. And so in applied ethics, the utilitarian approach, particularly the act utilitarian, where you look at each case and you adjust your ethical philosophy of how to approach, treating others, helps. Now I want to get into another area of theoretical approach to ethics, and that is social contract. The idea of social contract, of course, we have to remind ourselves that these are theories, and theories are tools, and tools are for us to use in order to understand. And once we gain deep understanding, then we can generate our own theories that, with the assistance of these previous theories, can give us a better understanding of how to conduct ourselves, how to become better human beings, if you like. So what's social contract all about? Again, we can go back to a couple centuries ago. Go back to 17th century and start with Thomas Hobbes, who in his long life, I believe he lived to be 91 or something like that, which is unusual for those days. In his long life, he went through different phases of looking at the human condition. But nonetheless, he stuck with his guns, if you like, and believed and preached with fervor that human beings essentially are self-interested beings. In other words, everything we do, according to Hobbes, is out of self-interest. All the actions that we take. And this is one of the arguments that people bring up against altruism, and saying, well, altruism is essentially people doing things to satisfy themselves for their own interest and all of that, and masking it with, oh, I'm concerned about the other, and so on. Of course, that's something that we can talk about. So Thomas Hobbes believed, well, given that we are these kinds of beings that have the ability to self-reflect, the ability to rationalize, and just like how Kant believed in the notion of reason being the ultimate, authority. Previous to Kant, Hobbes thought the same thing, among others. So Hobbes believed, well, we're rational beings, but the state of nature is such that we're always at perpetual war against one another, and if we leave it that way, we can destroy ourselves. And that's why we have wars and people trying to get rid of other people. And that's not a good way of being. That's not a way to organize societies and move towards civilization. And he theorized that there needs to be a contract, and organically societies do come up with contracts. And this doesn't mean that 305 million Americans get together and sign a contract and talk about the different terms and all that. Of course, our political representatives and so on do this sort of thing. But this is an implicit kind of approach to accepting the rules of a society, the way to live, the way to be, following certain codes, if you like. And that is the basis of social contract for Hobbes. Of course, keep in mind, I'm really simplifying these theories because, the short lecture, it's very difficult to just provide everything. But this is just the starting point. And the idea is to get a feel for how to approach ethics and then go beyond that and do additional inquiries, looking at various literatures and books and programs, audiovisual programs, and inquiry into social and historical events and so on. It will give us a better understanding of what ethics really is all about. So coming back to the notion of social contract, so Hobbes is thinking, well, we're all these self-interested, always scheming, always trying to figure out ways to gain interest for ourselves and all that, which connects to this notion of psychological egoism, or some people have brought it to the level of ethical egoism, thinking, well, this is what we need to do. We need to always look out for our own interests. And we've had influential people that have helped along, given that, particularly in the United States, we live in the most capitalistic societies of them all. Someone like Ayn Rand, she was known as a philosopher. She wrote a couple novels in talking about preaching selfishness and capitalism being the ultimate religion, and ultimately saying altruism is a fallacy and selfishness is the way to be, and we must embrace that, and which is a dangerous philosophy, of course. And this sort of ties into how Hobbes approached the notion of social contract. But let us pause, because that's not the whole story about social contract. After Hobbes, we've had the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was always interested in understanding what freedom means and tying freedom to morality, of course, right? Because to be free and to let others be free, to work in the state of freedom, one has to be moral. One has to be morally good. The way in which Rousseau looked at, and he wrote a book called Social Contract on this, and he's also credited for being the grandfather, at least the intellectual grandfather of the French Revolution. He looked at the opposite of freedom and the restrictions that human beings put on one another, the imposition of one attitude from one human being onto another, the imposition of institutions, and the enforcements of institutional rules and regulations, societal pressures, etc. He famously said, we are free, but in chains everywhere. Pointing to the fact that the ultimate freedom is one of those things that I said earlier, the possibility of impossibility. So what did Rousseau have to say about the human condition? In opposition to Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau thought that no, we do have tendencies for the selfishness, tendencies to become self-interested, scheming little bastards, if you like. However, we also have tendencies to be altruistic. We have tendencies we're hardwired perhaps to be able to care for our neighbors, to care initially for our family, for our children, for our parents, for brothers and sisters, cousins, uncles, neighbors, the merchant down the street, the fellow citizen who lives halfway across town or in another state, or the person who lives in a different continent, and yet he's a human being just like us. And we have tendencies to want to care about these people, regardless of how much interest it has for us, how much benefit it has for us, because we're human beings and we're all members of the same family. So it's the family approach that Rousseau brings to his notion of social contract, and of course, in alignment with the logic that Hobbes brought forward about how social contract comes about. He figured, well, societies, once they get civilized and they stop killing each other and they pay attention by way of education, by way of cultivation of these tendencies, they pay attention to their altruistic tendencies and start treating it morally, then societies start taking care of their members, and everybody benefits as a result. And that's the other idea of social contract. Now, one could say that in America, for example, there's a dichotomy. One way, the majority of Americans believe in what Rousseau brought forward, that sort of social contract where you care about the people of your society. On the other hand, because of the capitalistic principles being accepted as ultimate principles of setting up an economic system and a social system and all that, then the Hobbesian philosophy takes over, and many people think, well, I need to be a career opportunist, because if I don't do it, somebody else is going to destroy me, and I need to take care of myself. And then the selfishness takes over, and then ethical egoism comes into the picture. And so we have a crazy, ironic mixture of the two forms of social contracts operating in America today. Now, there is another figure, or two figures rather, that I must mention here, and we're talking about social contract. And one is John Locke, who's very influential in terms of creating, when the founding fathers, used the Greeks' philosophy of democracy and all of that. They also, John Locke was influential by looking at, he is credited for, inventing libertarianism as a philosophy. He's looking at, private property, and everyone being entitled to have property, and they should be free to do what they want with their properties and so on. Also, democracies should be set up as representative democracies, and that's what we have here. A work in progress, of course, when we say democracy, but it's representative. It's not popular democracy, so on. And that's the type of social contract that John Locke brought forward, which sort of builds a bridge between Hobbes and Rousseau here in that sense. Now, I'm talking about this stuff, various theories. This is how people set things up. Ultimately, in the ethical discussions, we're looking at values. We're looking at facts that influence values or are derived from values. We're looking at the way things are, the is, and the way things ought to be. Can we derive an is, an ought from an is? And this is ultimately an ongoing philosophical problem. The human condition is such that is fluid. It goes through pipes, and it leaks into one area, another area. It changes its color, it changes its pressure, it changes its temperature. It's always going through changes. And all these theories that I mentioned earlier are really a way of seeing the history of human condition. And by looking at that, you might be able to come up with a sort of a multitude of approaches to the human conduct. Because ultimately, we may or may not have a built-in conscience, but we do have a conscience. And conscience, this whole notion of conscience, is really the engine of morality, isn't it? We've heard the famous saying, Nietzsche, after saying, well, God is dead. We don't really need God anymore. We've come to a new place of understanding where we don't have to use God as an excuse to take away responsibility from, being ourselves and making who we are with our free will and, the will to power and all the rest of it that he came up with. What does that mean when he says, listen to your conscience? What does your conscience tell you? And this can be a very tricky business. And I think what can help us here is the work that the great psychologist and / philosopher, thinker, Erich Fromm, now if you're German, Erich Fromm, brought forward by understanding the notion of conscience. And I'll simplify it for in the interest of time and the sake of putting this very brief introduction together. But I do recommend the book Man for Himself, written by the Psychology of Ethics, written by Erich Fromm, or Eric Fromm, if you like. He looks at the notion of conscience, and he breaks it down into two categories. I think it makes a lot of sense. One form of conscience is the authoritarian conscience, the conscience that is formed as a result of voices of authority entering one's consciousness. And you're a child. First is your mother and father and your brother and your uncles and your teachers, and as you grow up, other voices of authority come in and tell you what to do, how to behave. These are the do's and these are the don'ts, and this is good and that is bad. And then cultural relativism enters the picture. In this culture, this is how we do these things, and this is the good and that is the bad, and so on and so forth. And we have tendencies to internalize this kind of indoctrination of the authoritarian voices coming in. And our psychology is such a way that we can put in inventory. We can categorize, we can put in different compartments, we can create shelves in our consciousness and have these ideas put in place. And sometimes, if we need them, go to the shelf and grab one and use it. People that are in the military, one could argue, have this seriously solidified authoritarian conscience. So if they are sent to go and kill some human beings because they're the enemy, because the authority, the brass tell the rank and file, go, and those are the bad guys, bomb them, shoot them, etc. And somebody asks the soldier, well, what does your conscience tell you? And the soldier says, well, I'm a professional soldier. My conscience tells me I'm doing good. I'm bringing freedom, democracy to the world. So I have to kill the bad guys in order to do it. So that's the kind of conscience that's been cultivated by authority. So, and that's what Fromm means by authoritarian conscience. But here's the other side. We may get cultivated and educated and develop this kind of authoritarian conscience. But we also have the ability to have what Fromm calls humanistic conscience. In other words, with the critical thinking skills that we have or develop, and in free societies, we can nurture and educate ourselves into knowing, we can develop our own conscience. away from the authoritarian conscience, sometimes cleansing the authoritarian conscience, extracting the poisonous forms of authoritarian conscience, and having our own kind of work in progress type of conscience. And then that's where Nietzsche's sort of little adage helps us. What does your conscience tell you? Well, my conscience tells me I have to examine, re-examine, rethink, decenter, recenter, and look at this idea from different perspectives before I take action, and not go with the automatic, the autopilot of the authority that has built this conscience for me, and act upon that. So the humanistic conscience really helps us in the ethical realm in order to be a morally good person. Existential philosophers and writers and artists, whether they're painters or filmmakers or poets, have helped us a great deal in understanding how this works. And one could say that of course, Erich Fromm was an existential thinker in many ways. In the existential realm of being, which is a moralistic approach to life, particularly when you look at the politics of existentialism, one has the responsibility for oneself. So God doesn't enter the picture. The divine command theory is irrelevant. The duty ethics and all of that may help us in some areas. The maxim of doing good, treating people as ends in themselves and all that. Yes, of course. But ultimately, the existential person has to take responsibility at all times for oneself. And because he or she is, in many ways, if you borrow thinking from Sartre, is condemned to be free. So if you're condemned to be free, here it is. You have this situation. You have free will. You can take action. You can do things. You can make decisions. What did Kierkegaard tell us? Either or. Right? He has this book called Either Or, where he talks about this kind of taking responsibility for oneself and making that decision. It could be life-changing. It could affect others. Could do good, or it could do harm. And ultimately, we cannot rely on authorities. We cannot rely on the voices of church. We cannot rely on other entities telling us what's good and what's bad. We must determine what is good based on the principle that we are responsible not only for ourselves, but to be treating other human beings who are also existential beings with dignity, and if we can help them, help them. If we cannot help them, not harm them. Right? So the benevolence of existentialism is also important here too. But it's always a struggle, isn't it? When you look at the writings of, say, Franz Kafka, for example, or whether it's a short story Metamorphosis, or The Trial, where the protagonist of the story never understands what is happening to him, never gets the point that he is the one that needs to apply free will and take responsibility for his life. And what happens? Life kills him. Right? He's at the end is executed. Or it's the writings of Albert Camus, the great, Algerian / French thinker, writer. It is a struggle, and these people, had the unique ability to translate these thinking and this existential angst, if you like, into writing, into this lucid form of prose, and telling us about the human condition, because that's ultimately the purpose of any kind of art form, to tell us something about the human condition, and it's ultimately a moralistic treatment of the human condition. So with that said, I'll stop this talk at this point, and I look forward to having more conversations with you and talking to you about various different ethical issues in areas of interest and so on. So till next time.